So I'm Lewis Herbert, I'm leading the City Council, and I'm also involved in the Greater Cambridge Partnership as Vice Chair. So essentially, the Movement and Spaces document is a plan, so it is a document that will link to the local plan, but in terms of how we're managing it, it's being led by the Greater Cambridge Partnership, and consultants there's an open invitation at the moment for appropriate expertise, and that will be decided in the middle of February. And we'll also at the end briefly discuss a process for continuing the engagement of the group that's represented in this room. So we've got 10 inputs effectively, and you've had 3 questions. We've only got an hour, or a bit under that, 3/4 of an hour. So it's a maximum of 2 minutes per contributor. There are 3 questions. Obviously there's going to be a wider write-up that Peter's going to lead on as well. So I'm just asking our 10 contributors to limit themselves. By all means say ditto to things, but obviously focus on something that came out of your group that adds to what's said. So we start with Rachel Stoppard, Greater Cambridge Partnership Group 1. So, and then if we get through these in 20 minutes even, then that would obviously enable us to have at least 20 minutes of open discussion from the floor. So, Rachel.
Thank you, Lewis. So obviously difficult to do a very wide-ranging discussion credit in 2 minutes. Also to say we were very lucky to have 2 of the speakers from the earlier session in our group. So Robert and Charlene were with us, so we did focus perhaps a little bit more on some of the issues that they raised in light of that. So we spent quite a lot of time initially talking about the benefits of shared space, but also some of the challenges that can raise at the same time. But there was generally a lot of support for thinking about some of the spaces and places in Cambridge that could benefit from that sort of approach. In particular, decluttering was getting a lot of support in our group. In terms of some of the other things that people had heard about, actually a lot of support for road charging, that something like that does need to change now in order to be able to fund some of the improved public transport. So there was an appetite to look at that, and we were talking about some of the experience that's happening in other places where they've tried those sort of systems to a large degree of success, and driverless vehicles as well. There's an interest to see that and how they could help prove useful in an overall solution. In terms of the second question, the spaces that we cherish, again, lots of different examples about the open spaces, some of the wild places, and what a lot of uniqueness there is in Cambridge, of course, that we want to treasure. And actually that was a bit of a theme in our discussion at this point about not ruining some of the special places that we have. So some anxiety about the impact of tourism, the impact of issues like homelessness that are affecting some of the spaces and public realm, and you know those need to be treasured and think about how we do it. On the final question, have I got to my 2 minutes? So there are lots of very practical examples that we captured, but generally I think making public transport much more attractive, ensuring that cycling also can work for everyone, and increase where possible were the main sort of themes, and not to forget walking, and that all of it should be design-led solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. So we had a great group, a really good range of discussions. On the first point, a lot of crossover with what Rachel has just said, but picking out some of the key themes about what excited people, particularly connectivity, linking up green spaces to other green spaces, but also green spaces to development. A lot of talk about shared spaces. Quite a good discussion around actually needing to think and plan ahead, and how important that is if we're going to get the right outcomes. Planning infrastructure comprehensively, and doing that before we do the development was a key theme. The metro came up a couple of times in our group, but also the fact that Cambridge is a space or a place where you can still see a lot of the special buildings, because we haven't got particularly tall buildings, so that was mentioned by a couple of people in the group. That was the first section. On the second section about special places, a very long list of places, so I won't list them all, but particularly a lot of talk around the green spaces generally, a lot of talk around the parks within Cambridge City and the increasing numbers of wildflower beds and so on. Very much appreciated. Market Square was mentioned, King's Parade, obviously a number of the colleges and so on within the centre. And somebody particularly talked about the traffic islands and how you can green even hard spaces by using flowers and trees on traffic islands. So they're the sorts of things that came up in the group. In terms of how to make sustainable travel options the norm, a lot of talk around enforcement. A number of the group talked around, if you like, or within the city centre, people not respecting other users of that space, and so we need more enforcement to make that work and therefore encourage more sustainable modes of transport. I think probably the biggest theme, as Rachel touched on, was around money, and so all of our group talked around the need for either a combination of or individually workplace parking levy, congestion charge, a particular set of views expressed around just general taxation, that locally we need to tax more to create money to encourage sustainable modes of transport, and also talking about needing to be honest with the public that if we do tax more, about how that then is put into specific measures like subsidising buses. Quite a bit of talk about franchising of buses, and also our group particularly talked about the frustrations with government providing bits of money over periods of time which actually don't allow long-term planning. So one of the key themes was to get better outcomes, we actually need to be able to plan long-term and have greater certainty over revenue funding streams.
Thank you, Brian. Rosie.
Thank you.
Thank you,
So we spoke mostly about transport across the whole time. So initially what excited us was the idea in the initial brief, not just thinking about cold engineering solutions, but use of the whole space and surrounding area, and including residents in that. There was quite a lot of differing views in the group, particularly in relation to whether we need a metro or we need to increase buses. There was a lot of concern that buses wouldn't have enough capacity, but there was some very strong feeling that metro was not possible and not the answer. Affordable public transport obviously is crucial, and we want through ticketing, integrated ticketing across different bus companies and across different modes of transport. Congestion charging was another contentious issue. Do we want it? Do we not? Would it provide any answers? However, what absolutely everyone agreed on was that we need bus franchising and we need the mayor to do it ASAP. Some of the other solutions were there have been thoughts to have walking maps of Cambridge. So greater information, we need more information about the buses that are available, and we need more information on cycle routes and walking routes. So people's areas that they cherish where the paths have been widened on public spaces, where roads have been closed to through traffic, Hobson's Conduit, all the Westfields and all green spaces across the city and around the city. So something that people cherish about Cambridge is that we have so many engaged, concerned residents who will come on a Saturday to an event like this and get engaged in keeping Cambridge special. And lastly, we had the thought that places where people can park themselves on a bench and enjoy the city, that's what we cherish.
Thank you. And next, Anna.
Okay, so given the time constraints, what I'm going to do is just bring out some of the key themes that came across the three of those discussions. So we kind of very much looked at this in terms of a context of a changing city and all the tensions that brings, and also the way that makes action really urgent. So this isn't something we can really afford to talk about for another kind of generation. We talked a lot about interrelationships, so the relationships between the urban and the green spaces, and it's that which makes our city. It's having both of those things together. The relationships between the city and the surrounding areas. We had some commuters in the group, and they were giving that sense of needing to connect the city with the areas around it. the relationship between residents, workers and tourists, and the challenges that tourism brings, and also interrelationships in terms, kind of very practically, in terms of the interchanges for public transport, and we were all very struck by that importance of making sure interchanges work so that everything flows really well. We talked about the importance of having a big picture, a big vision, and getting design early into a system. We talked about the importance of hearing all the voices, and whilst we said that it was really great that we were here today, we were all very aware there were lots of people who wouldn't come here. So an example given was our young transitory populations. How do we capture the views of those young people who perhaps wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning? How we listen to what they have to say? So really thinking about everyone. We were very struck between the interplay and the conflict between different goods, and that a good thing in one area might be a problem somewhere else. And that importance within that, not only to face the difficult questions, and that sense that we can't back away from difficult questions, but also that really important thing of working out what the questions are. And if we're not quite sure what the questions are we want to ask, we're not necessarily going to get the right answer, so really focusing on what those questions are. So that was us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Group 5, Mal.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You got me there? Yeah. Matthew asked us to address one very specific subject, which was the sustainable travel options. What should be the norm? Which was Charlene's list. If you can recall Charlene's list, it actually began with, it was on movement. It began with getting walking and cycling more significant, and then on the questions of the need to travel and online shopping. We began by, I think, sort of guessing really at the dynamic, the Cambridge dynamic. And we didn't really, we got a feel for the fact that it's growing, but we haven't got a sort of a recognised common language in terms of the rate at which it's growing. We then went on to talk about free parking, which is one of the access elements of it, and the degree to which residents' parking will reduce the number of cars coming into the city. We then talked about P&Rs, and I think we agreed that the P&R, whatever else, that the P&R network, when it's finally developed and expanded, will give us one of the essentials in persuading people to perhaps leave their cars at home and take to public transport. Anyway, P&R is where the support is. We then got on to income generation, and rather than talk about, we did talk about congestion charging, but we also talked about land value capture and the degree to which that could be hypothecated into transport. A little bit on dedicated buses for both private and public use. That's dedicated staff buses, and there is quite a network already in Cambridge, and maybe that is growing. How could it best be utilised? I worry about the current decline in bus usage, and I think very clear agreement as to why that existed. We went finally back to cycle path facilities and onto the greenways, which one or two people were aware of, but not everybody was aware of, and the degree to which that's going to, as an investment, is going to pay off. We have to learn, certainly, about new developments in terms of cycleways. We have to learn from our mistakes, and it's a question of whether we're doing that with places like Hills Road. And then finally, a point, going back to the beginning, about not knowing really where we are. We have no grasp about capacity. We have no grasp about the degree to which we can put more buses into the city centre, more cycles into the city centre, more tourists into the city centre, and more of us in the city centre. It does appear to be, and it's a hobby horse too, it does appear to be an expectation that there's finite capacity there, and it's just a question of organising ourselves to reach it.
Okay, thanks Mel, particularly focusing on transport and also obviously capacity there. Emma?
So our team took away that they were really touched by the concept of community forest and woodland, having some big open spaces and leaving a legacy. But new technology, before we leap to autonomous vehicles, is there anything we can be doing, like zip cars into villages? We wanted to take a greater look than just the middle of town, but actually see how these things adapt and are needed surrounding Cambridge. But it also then just triggered a discussion on deliveries and what can we actually do on deliveries. A trial by Outspoken for 50 days, say 500 miles of transportation around the city, so that really needed to focus. But it was health and air quality and also a design-led approach. But really when we came on to what we valued, it's the layering of history that really brings everybody together, and that's what we value. The river, arguably we would like more access. Heritage, the colleges, the archaeology, the Market Square, Portugal Place, the walkways around Newnham and Burrells Walk. But these places have adapted over time, and if we're creating new things, they need to be adaptable as well. And when do we judge these new spaces that we're creating, and when do we judge these new communities? And the general thought was actually after 50 years should be the point at which we look at things, whether they've been a complete failure or a complete success. However, could there be a basis on which we could capture Section 106 and put a small amount away for review in 2 years after the development's been delivered in order to go back and maybe fix some of the problems that are perceived by the community? But then that led on to things like lighting. And lighting came up as really important in terms of creating sustainable travel options. It's a balance. It's a balance in terms of look and the design of your street lights, through to also ecology, but also the safety aspect. If we're going to ask people to cycle more, walk more, how safe do they feel? But one of the things is there's possibly too many stakeholders. When do you engage? How do you capture everybody at the right moment, at the right time, and show them plans that they really understand and get to grips with before it's too late? The problem is that sometimes there are compromised situations and solutions that are creative, and then nobody really understands where they got to that point at the end. But really, we want to look at how do we increase landmarks in our developments. How can people really read the city and get around? How can they actually know where they are? Bus stops, should they be called the Fitzwilliam Museum bus stop rather than the corner of Trumpington Road and whatever road? We need to actually make it easy for people to work out where they are and where to get on and off the bus. And also, how can we get more access into the green belt? How can we get more permissive paths? How can we get more circular routes? Can we work with landowners and actually open up some more routes around the city? Bus franchising came up, the cost of buses came up a lot, and also how envious we are of those who have bus passes, who don't have to interchange between all the different bus operators and the different types of bus. But at the end of the day, we want greater enjoyment from the other options to the car. You know, we want fun, we want the places to be nice, we want the environments to be nice, and a reason to take public transport, and really then will you get people to move. So the concluding point is, we felt there should be a 5-year vision, say a 2022 challenge, that said, by that point, we will actually commit to doing these things, and then we use peer pressure to change people's habits. If we can start doing it with plastic bottles, we can start doing it with public transport.
Thanks, Emma, particularly about some of that space and sort of opportunities of making more of that. Stephen, number 7.
Thank you. Yes, we had like the other groups, we had a wide-ranging conversation around question 1. I think we saw a positive in the commitment and the opportunity provided by the study and this project, and indeed recognise people's commitment to participate in that. We had conversations about inclusivity of that process, recognising that not perhaps all of our citizens and businesses were represented here today, but trying to an ambition to make sure that we captured that, including particularly in the light of the shared spaces discussion, the engagement with people who have various disabilities or impairments, making sure that everyone's interests were covered. The rest of the conversation around question 1 was really around the choices that are involved in and the distinction between different types of spaces and context, and how that was carried forward into the study. In response to question 2, I've written corridors and commons clearly strongly valued by everyone in the group. There were individual references to particular spaces, but an overarching sense that the commons in Cambridge were hugely significant and important and valued, but also the links out to the countryside, the greenways to Grantchester and to Trumpington and so on. There was also universal support for effectively temporary spaces. So reference, I think there was a slide of Mill Road, but people hugely valued the opportunity that created for community cohesion, and the informal and temporary use of spaces was seen as a real positive, a real opportunity. With respect to question 3, as with the other speakers, there are probably 2 threads. Those are the push elements that might drive people to think carefully and make those choices. We talked about things like a private schools levy for parents using vehicles to drop their children from quite far and wide, to number plate lotteries, or the basis of odds and even numbers for access, as well as the conventional parking levies and access controls. And in terms of the pull components about how do you avoid people having to make those peak time choices of travelling into the city, we ranged quite widely from matters of broad social policy, so the touched upon the closure and the centralisation of amenities for citizens and residents in the centre of the city as a driver for why those people had to travel in, to trying to create some form of a kind of social conscience with both visible representations of things like air quality and vehicle usage, rather along the lines of the cycle thermometer on Parker's piece, so that people could understand the consequences and the choices that they were making and the impact that they were having on others.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, particularly some good thoughts there about just changing the way people behave. Jonathan, number 8.
Okay, thank you. I think it's worth saying that we had a very good discussion, and I think there was much that excited us during that discussion. I don't think we've necessarily stuck to the questions. But I think, sort of sadly, to start with, I suppose there was a feeling that we've seen a lot of this sort of stuff before. We've seen good strategies and good intentions, and we've got various SPDs which have been produced in the past. So I think the real challenge is to make a framework and a strategy that doesn't sit on the shelf and just gather dust, but actually can do something. And linked into that is kind of the delivery of that strategy. And part of that delivery needs to think around auditing where these things haven't necessarily worked before, and what can we do better. I think one thing that did seem to excite us in our group was the idea of the community forest, and I think it led into the idea of the commons being valued, the hierarchy of green spaces in the city being absolutely valued, and the idea that that could form some sort of overall destination. But I think it was really clear that there shouldn't be just an intensification of our open spaces. We really value that some of those spaces are quiet spaces, they're contemplative spaces, and that you can't just keep adding things in a piecemeal way. We had an exciting idea about kind of Regent Street, but actually how you might start to think about some of the city streets more widely. The idea that actually instead of kind of going through lots of plans and lots of engineering drawings and things, you could actually just do these things on a trial basis. You could get some straw bales, you could get some skips, you could block off Regent Street, you could think about kind of how much space is allocated to a certain use, and then that may be a way, and a number of the speakers have talked about how you engage with groups who aren't represented here today and who actually are difficult to engage with in the first place. So, you know, if someone's walking along the street and they see some straw bales, it might actually make them stop and ask what's going on. And in a way, you can start to kind of adjust and modify things on the ground. And I think that links into the sort of design or decisions being based on flexibility. Things may seem appropriate now, but as we start to think about autonomous vehicles and other things like that, technology is changing rapidly, and so something can't be stuck in a certain point in time. It needs to be capable of adaptation and change. We talked also about a hierarchy, and clearly, you know, pedestrians, cycles, buses, then cars and deliveries is kind of where we think it needs to be. And that links into also thinking about delivery strategies in the city. And I suppose, you know, streets not necessarily having to perform a function at a particular time. Refuse collection was talked about, congesting things at peak time. Could residents start to say, actually, we don't want that level of congestion at that time? Can it be done at another time? And possibly even pay for that privilege. The other key thing was about, as we think about spaces around the city, it's not just about the historic core, it's about those other spaces, and a lot of focus can be on those sort of heritage assets, etc. But actually there are key spaces embedded within communities who are sometimes forgotten. And I think that leads into the final point, which is really about, as we move forward with consultation, ensuring that we engage with a diverse range of people. This is the first in a kind of consultation process, but as the SPD goes forward, there will be many more opportunities, and we've got to think really hard and challenge ourselves about how we reach out and positively engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Mark Richards on 9.
Well, I'm in the fortunate position, not as fortunate as my neighbour here, to be at number 9, where most of the things have already been mentioned, I think, that came up. Try and address some of the questions which were put to the group. The themes and ideas that it got excited about. The community woodland was a big hit. I think that's something which we saw as being the threshold, maybe between the city and how maybe there's not so much containment, but actually a way of an interface maybe more, and a way of getting around the city. By enjoyment, by bike, by cycling, running, however, and actually creating a healthy community using that sort of woodland. And tying into that was the green fingers were the special spaces really that connected the city, and they should be certainly retained and if not reinforced by potentially even more tree planting. Obviously, winds and other things take those down, but not much new trees actually get planted as a result of that. A big theme that came across in our group was about this engagement. It's already been mentioned, but we were trying to think actually engagement with schools, particularly with the children, and getting the children to actually go back in reverse psychology. We talked a lot about psychology and behaviour, and actually the design group that actually gets involved to actually look at this involves other disciplines, not just designers and highway engineers and what have you, actually psychologists, behavioural scientists, those sorts of people, to actually influence what sort of messages do we give to communities, and then how do we engage those communities. So that other communities were also getting buy-in through workplace and employers, talking directly to how people get to work, what would make their lives easier, etc. Local groups, local communities. We talked about being much more innovative in terms of having experimentation with regards to the open spaces. Could people be invited, just like we had the Cllr for the local plan, for developers to come forward with development sites, but could there be an opportunity to say to local communities, local streets, hey, we've got some money here, we want to look at open spaces, shared spaces, a green way of looking at the way that we might improve the city. Do you want to get involved? Do you want to put your street forward and get engagement that way? So it's actually reversing the way in which it's currently done, which is to actually tell people what's going to be happening in their street. You're inviting people to come together as a community and actually reinforce what it is that they want in their street or in their local environment. Other themes was about road safety. Could we look at the timings of particularly heavy vehicles and when they're travelling, relative to make it safer potentially for children to cycle to school? I mean, if there's a way of actually doing that at all, whether that's maybe through construction traffic, we all say, well, you can start your site at 8 o'clock, but is there a way of actually improving the safety for children to start getting onto bikes? Because I think that was a concern about, well, if you can get them from the villages to the town, that's all very good by bike, but how safe are they? And that might be one of the concerns associated with the parents' concerns, certainly. And also, we talked a lot about the innovation of transport themes. We might be just focusing on the models today. We need to have maybe a special group that's actually looking at future ways of transport, whether it is driverless vehicles at all, what impact is that going to have on parking structures within the city, how that might influence the types of levies that you might create, whether that's bus travel or not. You know, if you get these rental vehicles which are driverless, is the buses going to be such a big issue in the future? So having a different alternative look with a separate group maybe might be an opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks Mark both for the thoughts there about communities having greater say, including about their space and their streets, and also about the future. Last but not least.
Right, thank you. Well, I think what did excite us, I think the trouble with the first presentations was that we felt really, to a certain extent, we've heard it all before. And that actually I noticed that there was no mention of social equity and no mention of pollution in any of those. Well, there was one mention of pollution in those things. So that was the issue. We need to make sure that we are doing things that are new, but we seem to have been around this loop too many times before, and we need to be learning from history. Regarding the second thing, I think we talked about the integration of landscape and townscape, and actually that it was important to have things that were aesthetically pleasing. But one of the things about Cambridge is that it is a vibrant city, it is growing, it's not in aspic, and that densification is not necessarily a sin. But we need to have a place of contrasts. So going on to the third part, which was realistically, and realistically, we mustn't be attempting to do things which are the bleeding silly edge. I spent 30 years working in the leading edge, and sometimes it got into the bleeding edge, but I hope I never got into the bleeding silly edge. So effectively, that means that charging that discourage the least sustainable options seems to be very obvious. And I would say that park and ride doesn't mean leaving your car at home, it means driving your car to a parking site. So there is an issue there. We need to have charging that does that, and be that workplace charging or residential charging, because basically if we can reduce the volume of private cars coming into Cambridge, then effectively the public transport can operate more efficiently. But there are other things that need to be done with public transport, in that we do basically need a better, more continental style ticketing system, which I suspect does mean that we need certain of the things which the mayor has powers over. So we talked about rural hubs as being an alternative to park and ride sites, which can help actually also perhaps be delivery hubs as well. So if there's community transport to those, we then have a system which does enable the least advantage to gain access to the city centre without the need for a car. So now, I was going to say about forest, this is just my opinion. How do we get to the 800-acre wood? We talked about woods. There is an 800-acre wood by the university, but actually it's almost impossible to get to it except by car. So I would say that is the issue, that we can have these lovely woods or lovely areas outside Cambridge, but it is important that we can get access to them, and we shouldn't have people driving out and parking their car just to take their dog for a walk.
Thank you to all 10, and thank you to all of the contributors. I think you see quite